Hey guys, welcome back. Thought I would use this video here to look back and see where I've been with respect to the three telescopes that I have now. I've been using them now for about 1 year. And I thought I'd go back in this video and take a look back at some of the photographs I've taken and some of my impressions on using refractors versus the reflector, short focal length versus long focal length, and just bounce that off of you and see what you guys think. Let's start off with the pictures that I've taken with the Redcat 51. The Redcat 51 is a 250 millimeters, basically a camera lens for all intents and purposes. It has a helical focuser here, a nice dew shield, a batten-off mask that's incorporated into the lens cap, which is nice. I've got my ZWO off-axis guider, the filter wheel, and my ASI 1600 mono camera. And so I've been using primarily narrowband processing with this particular scope because this scope is especially well suited to large nebula targets, with the exception of M31 here, the Andromeda Galaxy, in which case this is a combination of the luminance, red, green, and blue filters, plus some HA that I've captured. But you can see here a smattering of the four, at least these four pictures that I've taken with this scope over the past year, and I'm coming from the world where I've been taking pictures through the soda straw, as it were, of a SCT. It's really enlightening to get a different perspective on the nighttime sky, and you begin to understand just how large some of these structures are that are up there, and yet we cannot see them because they're so faint. The Redcat 51 does a great job of being able to image and capture the entire picture, the Cygnus loop in its field of view, and it's just it's a very interesting picture of supernova remnant. I think it's really quite striking to see the scale of this picture that you wouldn't get with a higher focal length telescope. Meanwhile, the Heart Nebula over here, which also has the Fishhead Nebula tacked on as a freebie, is another interesting target, but yet the Redcat 51 is not large enough, or doesn't have a small enough focal length to also capture the Sol Nebula, which you can see just peeking in off to the upper right here. But I'm really pleased with the field of view that the Redcat 51 gives me in order to capture the whole Heart Nebula with a little bit of surrounding sky or dark sky around it to kind of give it a sense of context. And the optical quality of the Redcat 51 is just fantastic. I really have enjoyed using it. And then, of course, the one galaxy that's particularly well suited to the Redcat 51 is M51, and I want to go back and do some more imaging of this. I have put some HA in here, but I want to go back and collect some more data and try to pull out more detail on these dust lanes here. Still, I'm relatively pleased with the image that the Redcat 51 gives for the Andromeda Galaxy. It fits comfortably in the field of view. I suppose you could go up to about 400 millimeters of focal length, and you would fill up the field of view with this particular galaxy. It's one of the few galaxies really that are appropriate for the Redcat 51 just because of its large focal length. Most galaxy targets are very small in the field of view of even larger, much larger focal length telescopes. And then over here we have IC 410 and 405, the Flaming Star Nebula and the Tadpoles Nebula here, and the Redcat 51 is very well suited to capturing both of these nebula targets as a pair, and I think it's very interesting. So I've very much enjoyed using the Redcat. I can't even begin to tell you how convenient it is. In my particular setup, I take the tripod and the mount out and hopefully leave it out there for several days during clear nights. But I bring the telescope in, bring the optics, the camera, and the telescope in every morning, and then take it out every night. So having a telescope that you can just grab around the barrel, loosen up the grips on the mount, and carry it in with no problem, no worries about bumping into the door frame it is so convenient. And also having a very short focal length means that you're not that sensitive to guiding errors from seeing or from wind. It also is a very low profile physically, so it's not buffeted around by wind like a much larger telescope would be and is. So the Redcat 51 is just an absolute pleasure to use. It's a carefree telescope, and I really have come to enjoy that telescope quite a bit, and looking forward to getting back to using it. Now, the ED102, which is the first refractor I bought, this is it's about a 700 millimeter focal length. It's got the FCD 100 glass, so it's fairly good glass. I don't think it's the best glass that they have. It is a triplet design, and I have the filled flattener, which is not a focal reducer, it's a filled flattener, so I don't lose any focal length, which is good with this particular telescope. I'm still working to try to nail down a bit of stretched stars in the corners, but you can see here some of the pictures that I've taken with this particular telescope. And one of the things that I've enjoyed doing is I've had different telescopes with different focal lengths. It's kind of nice to be able to go back, for example, and get the Eastern Veil Nebula here, get the Fish Head Nebula here, and get in particular, focus on the Tadpoles Nebula here, that are all part of what I took pictures of in a much bigger, broader context with the Redcat 51. The Eastern Veil down here, the Fish Head Nebula here, and the Tadpoles Nebula here. So one of the things that I have enjoyed doing is going back between these different telescopes and collecting data on the same target, but because it's a wider field of view or a more narrow field of view, you get different levels of detail or different levels of context for the whole nebula target in and of itself. The 700 millimeter focal length is really well suited for the Elephant Trunk Nebula. It captures it in terms of size, filling up the frame very well. So I'm very pleased with how it handled that particular target. And I'm also pleased with how it handled the Crescent Nebula. The Crescent Nebula is a relatively small target, but I think it's a good size for this particular field of view. Now, in the processing of this particular target, I seem to have emphasized the oxygen 3 data a little more than to bring out the blue a little more than I did the hydrogen alpha here. But one of the things that I find that I've really enjoyed about this particular picture is how with this slightly wider field of view, you can capture what looks like to be flames licking around the edges of the Crescent Nebula, and so I think it makes a very dramatic looking picture. You get a bit of the detail in the Crescent Nebula, but you also get some context in the broader nebular region. And now, as we get into a bit longer focal length, going up from 250 millimeters now to 700, now we can start tackling some galaxy targets. Maybe not individual galaxies, although M81 is a fairly large target, a very large galaxy from where we stand here on the Earth, and it probably is appropriate for this particular focal length. There aren't many galaxies that are large enough to be imaged on their own with this telescope. M33 is one, M101 is another. There are several, but this scope is particularly well suited to doing galaxy clusters like the M81, M82 pair that I'm showing here, as well as the Leo triplet and some other galaxy clusters that I just haven't gotten around to doing yet. But I think you're starting to get be able to deal with some galaxies that you just can't do with a much shorter focal length. I got into this hobby because I was really interested in some pictures a friend of mine was taking at the time. He had a CGM mount, he had a Celestron C9.25 SCT, and he was taking some really fascinating pictures of galaxy targets. So I bought a CGM mount. Of course, I had to buy a C9.25 just so it would be a little bit bigger. It's a pain in the neck to deal with this scope and all the challenges that come with a long focal length. The nominal focal length is 2,350 millimeters. And right now, with things set up the way they are, I'm coming in with an effective focal length of 2,220. When you start getting up into the 2,000 focal length, now all of the targets that are out there for galaxies are accessible with this kind of focal length. And obviously the jewel of the nighttime sky in the northern hemisphere is M51. I've also been doing a lot, adding hydrogen alpha to my galaxy targets, as well as the RGB data. NGC 5907, kind of an edge-on spiral galaxy, was one of the first ones I tackled here in this particular galaxy season. And M106, which is in this field of view is fairly large, along with its satellite galaxy up here. And finally M101, which just barely fits without the focal reducer into this field of view. Galaxies are what this focal length does best, but there are so many nebula out there, small planetary nebula, detailed regions within larger nebula that are very appropriate for a scope with this kind of focal length. For example, the Crescent Nebula here, in this case I did not overemphasize the oxygen signal, but you can see that the Crescent Nebula in the field of view of the C9.25 fills up the field of view, whereas in the field of view of the ED102 700mm scope, it's shown more in context with the surrounding nebulosity around it, and I think that adds some drama to the picture in the case of the ED102. But it also is very interesting to see the kind of extra detail and focus on the extra detail that you see when you can use a higher focal length scope to pull out some of that detail. And then of course there's the very famous picture up here, M16, the Eagle Nebula, and the Pillars of Creation, which are fairly prominent in this picture still. A larger focal length would pull these out more. A Hubble telescope does a great job if you can get your hands on one of those. It's one of the big issues you have as you go up in focal length is that you become much more sensitive to wind. You're much more sensitive to seeing. Every problem that goes along with astrophotography increases with focal length. But you have access to many more targets with a large focal length telescope, including those that are in our own neighborhood. This particular focal length in the 2,000 millimeter range is really good for that kind of imaging. There's a cost with each one of these telescopes, and what I've done here basically is take the Explore Scientific lineup of telescopes and their corresponding cost, and the Celestron lineup of Schmidt-Cassegrain telescopes and put their costs in here. And so I've got the focal length along the horizontal axis, and I've got dollars along the vertical axis. And then this line of refractor telescopes, this is carbon fiber tubes with the highest quality glass, and as you're going out in focal length, you're also going up in aperture, which means you have larger glass surfaces. And as a result of the high precision needed to machine the glass into the proper shape, and the multiple pieces of glass that have to fit together to make sure all the colors come into focus at the same point, the refractors get extremely expensive, extremely fast as you go up in focal length. Meanwhile, this is where the reflector type telescopes and really begin to shine. It takes a lot less effort. You're not machining glass. You're just bouncing light off of spherical mirrors. They are much more cost effective. From a length perspective, the Schmidt-Cassegrain reflector is convenient, at least in the sense that light bounces back 3 times along the tube before you get back to your imaging sensor. So the scope is shorter than a very long refractor would be. The corresponding points going higher end here are the Edge HD versions of the same scope. So you have the C8, the C9.25, the C11, and the C14, just depending on which one you want. And then you have the HD versions of those scopes with a little better image quality. You just can't get to these focal lengths by using a refractor, at least, again, not for practical cost perspective. So this does separate out the cost of manufacturing these two types of telescopes. Really does separate these two. Refractors are great for focal lengths less than 1,000 millimeters, and reflectors are great for focal lengths greater than 1,000 millimeters, just to put a rough number on it. Let's just summarize some of my observations of what I've encountered over the past year of using these 3 telescopes. The telescope or telescopes that we're using is some balance of how much does it cost, how easy is it to use, and how many targets are there for us to look at with that particular telescope. For this purpose of this conversation, I'll keep it within the the refractors that I have, which call it less than 800 millimeters. These scopes really are the nebula hunters, the big targets out there, the spatially large in the field of view. And I'll be interested in hearing your comments back on this video. I've never used a refractor without a monochrome camera and filters and narrowband filters, so I would recommend that this is the kind of, when you're using a refractor less than 800 millimeters, you probably want to pair that refractor with a narrowband imaging system. Great optical quality, and I'm talking about the 3-element optics here, but I say greater than 3 elements because you're almost always going to have or want to have that 4th element. In the case of the Redcat 51, the 4th optical element, 4th lens, is included in the body of the telescope, and that lens provides a flat field. In other words, it prevents stars from getting stretched or elongated up in the corners and the outer perimeter of the field of view. And if you buy a refractor like my ED102 from Explore Scientific, I had to buy a field flattener as a 4th lens element, if you will, that is intended to cut down on the stretched stars in the corners. The cost goes up fast, as we saw in that chart, but these scopes are extremely convenient. I'm dying to get back to using my refractors if I can peel myself away from my SCT. They're easy to carry in and out if that's something you have to do. They're far less demanding on the guiding, so seeing effects, wind effects, amounts with questionable mechanical operation, you're much more tolerant of those kinds of disturbances with a shorter focal length refractor. And they tend to be faster. They collect light very fast. The downside of that is there's a more limited target selection. They're tend to be not very good for individual galaxies or smaller nebula, and there's a lot of those targets up there. When you go with a shorter focal length refractor, you are necessarily cutting out a good portion of the available targets up there to image. Very convenient, very easy to use, very easy to get up to speed on, but you are limiting yourself in terms of the target availability and the versatility of that telescope. Reflectors, in this definition, I'm talking about reflectors with a focal length, an effective focal length greater than about 1400 millimeters. These scopes are the galaxy and planet hunters. If you want to take pictures of planets, if you want to take pictures of galaxies and have those targets be large enough in your field of view, you really are talking about a telescope with a large focal length or a long focal length. As such, because galaxy targets and planets, they are best imaged in RGB, you can use a one-shot color camera like a DSLR or some of the cooled one-shot color cameras, for example, that ZWO offers. However, dealing with a scope like this, you are giving up a bit of optical quality. There's awesome target selection with these reflectors. Once you get up into the high focal lengths, you have planets, you have galaxies, you have nebula. All of them are available to you throughout the year. So this focal length is a great choice for year-round imaging. Problem with it is absolutely nothing convenient about this. Everything is worse as you go up into focal length. Based on my experience in this past year and using these 3 telescopes, you can't beat the cost and target selection that go with a long focal length system. You just need to be prepared to accept frustration and learning as your constant nighttime companions. That's my 2 cents worth. I think I'll leave you with a montage of some of the pictures I've taken so you can see what the different pictures look like for the different focal lengths. I'll talk to you guys later. Enjoy.